Okay. Well, the Middle Tennessee and the southern Middle Tennessee, Kentucky area developed a horse that had an extremely smooth gait. In fact, it was so smooth that when the rider was riding a horse, the head moves in a straight line, no bounce. And this was also a mule breeding area that farmers bred their mares to jacks in order to get mules to work their farm in order to sell also. And the other thing is that this area, and especially around Columbia and Murfreesboro, was a big standard horse breeding area. Now the standard horse is the one that used to pull the two-wheel carts in a race. And back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, harness racing, it was called, was a more popular sport than auto racing is now. All the major newspapers carried the results of the big races. And this was a big center for the racing horses, and there's a man named Pop Greer from Columbia that won national after national championship. But the smooth walking horse was developed in this area, and also the mules were developed, were bred here. The plantation owners from the south used to come to Middle Tennessee and buy their mules to work the plantation. And that's the reason Columbia still has a mule day. It's a carryover from those days. But while those plantation owners were here, they encountered this real smooth, easy riding horse that had been developed here. So they started buying them and take them back because they sat in the saddle all day long going over the plantation. And they became so popular for plantation owners that they became known as plantation horses. So the first walking horses were originally known as plantation horses. Mary Catson's great-great-grandfather, the man in the picture, was breeding jacks to raise mules. And his father had also bought one of the smooth, easy gaiting colts from Lewisburg several years earlier. And in fact, the mare that he bought had a colt, and she also had a colt that was named Gertrude that Mr. Brantley owned and used. And almost all of the local families had a good plantation horse. That's what the kids rode to school, and that's what the mothers drove to the buggy to go to town or go to church. They were very gentle disposition, and 4 kids could pile on their back and talk off to school. So Mr. Brantley had one of those plantation mares, but in 1903 he lost his jack, and the breeding season was getting ready to start, so he was looking for another jack to buy. And he heard about a good jack in the Viola community. Now, he lived in the Noel community that's in the northeast corner of the county. Viola is in Warren County, just off the west corner, or southeast corner of Coffee County. So one March day, he hitched Gertrude to the buggy, excuse me, hitched Gertrude to the buggy and made the all-day trip across the county and looked at the jack, and it's exactly what he wanted. Big jack, young, excellent conformation. And when Mr. McCullough priced him at $400, now $400 back in 1903 was like us going down and buying a new Ford pickup with all the extras. So when Mr. McCullough priced him at $400, Mr. said, "Oh," I said, "got a problem." but I didn't bring enough money. But he says, I like the jack, I'd really like to buy him, but I'm going to have to go back home and borrow some more money. And they agreed that if Mr. Brantley was able to get the money, that he would contact Mr. McCullough by phone. Well, there's another problem. The nearest phone to Mr. Brantley was in Beech Grove, over 3 miles away. The nearest phone to Mr. McCullough was in a store in Viola, 5 miles away. Mr. Brantley had no problem getting the money, but when he tried to get back in touch with Mr. McCullough, they kept missing each other. And so 2 weeks later, Mr. Brantley hitched Gertrude to the buggy and went back across the county. And when he told Mr. McCullough he was there to buy the jack, Mr. McCullough said, "Oh," said, "we got another problem." He said, "Now the breeding season has started, and I hadn't heard from you, and I figured you didn't want the jack, so I have made arrangements to start breeding the jack myself. But it says I needed a tease horse." Y'all have any idea what a tease horse is? Okay, all right. He said the only old stallion that I could find was supposed to be a 17-year-old standard bred horse that I had to pay $110 for him. So now I'll still sell you the jack, but you're going to have to buy the stallion and the deal because I don't need him if you take the jack. Mr. Brantley went down and looked at the old horse and really liked the way that he moved around the lot and how he walked. And he thought he recognized him as one that one of his cousins had owned in previous years. So he came back home and made a many-mile trip checking the breeding of the horse, and he finally determined that yes, he was a registered standard bred horse. So he borrowed the extra money, went back and bought the jack and the stallion and brought him back to his farm in Noah and started breeding them. And this was in 1903, and the horse lived until 1910. And in that time, he had bred many, many mares at Mr. Brantley's barn. In fact, the first year he stood him in service, as over 50 mares came to him. And one of his first breedings was to his mare Gertrude, and she had a roan coat that turned out to be another exceptional horse. In fact, his registered name is Roan Allen, and today every single living walking horse traces his bloodline back to Roan Allen, and of course to AllanF1, the old horse. Well, in 1935, the owners of these horses got together and decided that they wanted to get them certified as a separate breed of horse. In order to do that, they had to form an organization, get bylaws and constitution, and a registry. So they determined that they would register any horse that was known to have done the walking gait or to have produced offspring that did the walking gait. And they would register deceased mares or sires, and if they were deceased, they'd get an F in front of their registration number. So they closed that part of the registry in 1938, and then started looking back at all the sires that were registered to determine who the foundation sire of the walking horse breed should be. And when they finished all the computations, it ended up that there was one horse that had more animals registered in his background than all the other stallions that had been registered put together. There's one horse, the old Tease horse. So he was named the foundation sire of the Tennessee Walking Horse breed. And a little more to the story. He was really a mystery horse. Nobody really knew how he got to Tennessee. They knew he was in the standard bred registry. They knew his dam was a horse named Allendorf, and they knew that his dam was a mare named Maggie Marshall. But that's all they knew. So there's a fellow from Cheverville that was one of the big enthusiasts of the Allen-bred horse, decided he was going to find out. So they knew that he was a standard bred, and the big standard bred sale was in Louisville, Kentucky, that's called a Tattersall sale now.
Lexington, Kentucky.
Pardon?
Lexington, Kentucky.
Yeah, Lexington, okay. But in Kentucky. So Mr. McGill went to Lexington and started going through the library, and they knew that he was his foal date, and they started looking through the sale registry for the name of Allen, and there were so many other names that were similar to that they just finally gave up and said, well, let's look at his dam, which is Maggie Marshall. It's not a very unusual name. So they were lucky. They found the name of Maggie Marshall. And her coat was sold to a man from Murfreesboro that was Allen. And the man paid $350 for it and brought him back to Murfreesboro. But the reason he was sold is that his dam, Maggie Marshall, was a record-setting trotting horse. And she had a colt prior to Allen that a man from Ohio had bought and put him on the racetrack, and he too turned out to be a record-setting trotter. So the man from Ohio came back, bought Maggie Marshall and the colt that she had at that time that was Allen, took him back to Ohio, and when Allen got of age to start his training, they put him in harness, and he wouldn't trot, he would pace. And they kept working with him, and he never would pace really fast enough to satisfy the owner, because he wanted record setting. So the owner brought him back to Kentucky and entered him in the sale when he was 5 years old. And that's where a fellow named Mencken from Murfreesboro brought him and brought him back to his stable. Now, he also started training him and working him. And they said that he would really run a good race, but he wouldn't finish good right at the end. So he was farmed out to several other trainers, and they all came in pretty well with the same story. So the owner in Murfreesboro said, well, we'll make a breeding stallion out of it. Well, here's a standard bred horse that has not set any records. He doesn't have any background. And right across the street from this stable was another stable that had a world champion standard bred horse. A few miles down the road was another stable that had another world champion standard bred horse. So this unknown really didn't get much of a chance of any mares coming to him when other stallions were close by. So finally the owner gave up on him and sold him to a neighbor, and the neighbor put him in an auction and he was sold from for $95 to someone near the Coffee County or Bedford County line. And this fellow owned him for about a year, and couldn't get anybody to breed to him, so he sold him. And that man tried and then sold him again, and he ended up with Mr. Brantley's cousin. And I think Mr. Brantley's cousin traded a colt and a heifer calf and a $20 bill for him. Well, his cousin tried breeding him, didn't have any luck, so he traded him again. And at one time he ended up owned by Dr. Price here in Manchester that left him hooked to the buggy 24 hours a day. And he was traded again, and finally ended up in the Hillsborough. A fellow named Winton had traded a calf for him. And that's where Mr. McCullough found him and bought him for $110. But a week later, then he sold him to Mr. Brantley. So the old tease horse ended up being the foundation sire of the walking horse breed. And the colt that I mentioned earlier, AllanF1byJohnWright, was also a world champion horse. And like I said, his bloodline is in every known walking horse today. And an interesting story to that is the picture back here on top, head of the mare with the horse with a blazed face. That was Rhode Island's band. When the celebration started, when the Breeders' Association started, and finally they decided, well, we need to set up a Hall of Fame for horses that have been well known and had good performance. So they started registering all the, or nominating horses for the World of Fame. And Gertrude was never mentioned. So this year, a lady that has the Walking Horse Museum, as the curator of the museum in Wartrace, was going through some pedigrees, and she suddenly realized that every horse traced back to Gertrude through Rhode Island. But Gertrude has never been mentioned as a candidate for the Hall of Fame. And when she brought it up, everybody said, put her in. So she was inducted into the Hall of Fame this year.